They laughed and drove off, after tying him up and leaving him in the middle of an empty road like rubbish. They believed it was the night's greatest joke was that they didn't know who they were teasing. This isn't a tale about forgiveness, but let's go back to the beginning. As we reflect on this story, subscribe and don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more daily stories that need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button. After years of service, 55-year-old Walter Crane was the type of man who believed in doing things the right way. He had finally returned to his hometown as a citizen, but as the recently appointed chief of police, his position wasn't just a title. It was a mission. He had big plans to clean up the mess that corruption had left behind in the department. But he didn't realize that his first day would not go as planned. It was late at night, and Walter was driving along a peaceful section of a highway in his old pickup truck, which had seen better days but was dependable, and Walter liked things with personality. Wearing his go-to red MAGA cap and a beat-up jacket, he felt completely at home. The road was deserted, the kind of quiet that allows your thoughts to wander, and then he heard flashing lights in the distance. He mumbled, lowering the gas and pulling to the shoulder. It had to be an error because he wasn't speeding and his registration was current. Perhaps there was a broken tail light, but he wasn't. Two officers approached Truck Officer Brian Harper, who was big and stocky with a perpetual, "Evening," Sir Harper said, leaning against the driver's side door like he owned the truck. "You know your headlights outright," smirking as he led the way, with his sidekick Derek Green trailing a few steps behind and spinning his baton in a manner that seemed to exude arrogance. Walter gave up his license and registration while maintaining a polite demeanor, saying, "There's no need to escalate things, Harper, barely." Walter nodded calmly. "Thanks for pointing that out, officer. I'll take care of it first thing tomorrow." Looked at the papers while Green walked around the truck and tapped the hood with his baton, as though it were some sort of questioning teak. "You seem incredibly composed for someone who was stopped on a deserted road," Green observed in a suspicious tone. "What's the rush?" Grandpa had to go somewhere significant. Walter arched an eyebrow but remained composed. "After a hard day, I'm merely going home in no rush." Green leaned forward, his brows narrowing. "What's up with the hat?" "I'm a huge fan of slogans. Do you think that makes you unique?" "I'm the new chief of police," Walter stated steadily as he inhaled slowly, fighting the want to react. "I'm sure this is simply the cops briefly misunderstood one another before." Harper, the chief of police, started laughing. Before Walter could say anything more, "That's rich. Then you'll tell us you're running for mayor." Green shook his head. "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States." Harper grabbed the door handle and got out of the car, saying, "Sir, let's make sure everything checks out." Walter frowned and said, "I've given you all my documents, so there's no need for this now. Your questioning procedure." Walter knew better than to protest, so he unbuckled his seatbelt as Harper flung back his tone, mockingly saying, "You either step out or we help you out your call." Fastened my seatbelt and left. Despite the mounting strain, Green stood tall and abruptly yanked in behind him. Walter remarked, keeping his voice steady, "Whoa, what's this about?" as Green smacked him with a set of handcuffs. "It's thorough," Green answered, grinning. "Just in case you're not as innocent as you look." Meanwhile, Harper was searching the truck, removing odd objects and throwing them to the ground, including a grocery bag. After a worn jacket, Harper exclaimed, "Look at this," holding up Walter's red cap as if it were a trophy. "Big patriot over here think this makes you are impenetrable." "You're making a mistake," Walter remarked firmly, and both of you Green laughed as he tightened the cuffs. "Oh, what will you do, Chief?" "Write us a memo with strong language." Harper joined in, throwing the cap back into the truck, saying, "Relax, old man. We're just doing our job." Walter said nothing, standing silently as they carried on their search, understanding that this was more than just the headlight anymore, and that these men were seeking an excuse rather than the truth, and from their perspective he had already given them one. The road stretched endlessly. Towering trees that appeared to smother the moonlight lined the path into the night. Green and Harper Walter became even more isolated as the ancient truck bounced along, still high on their misguided authority. When the car finally screeched to a stop, the air outside was thick and cold, with a faint whistle of wind cutting through the stillness. The headlights were cutting through the darkness on the uneven terrain, but Walter wasn't paying attention to the road. Instead, he was focused on calculating whether these people who thought they could intimidate him knew who they were dealing with. With a sneer that was virtually gleaming in the faint light, Harper yanked open the passenger door and said, "All right, Grandpa." He grabbed Walter by the arm and added, "You go. Time for a little lesson in respect." Walter didn't fight and got out of the car. Looking about the area, which was empty, no homes, no streetlights, just the suffocating quiet of the "this seems overkill" woodland. Harper grinned and shook his head, saying, "Oh, we'll get there. But first we're going to make sure you understand the pecking order around here." Walter remarked calmly but firmly, "If you got a problem with me, let's settle it back at the station." Green emerged from the trunk, pulling a ragged rope that appeared to have seen better days. "But you didn't anticipate your evening would finish this way, Chief." "You're both making a huge mistake," Harper remarked, rolling his eyes, but Walter stood tall and refused to exhibit any fear. "We'll worry about that later." Before they pushed Walter up against a corroded metal post, probably an old road marker, before he could react. Remaining after the place was deserted. Green and Harper worked swiftly to secure him in position by tying the rope firmly over his arms and chest. The knots were difficult and dug into his jacket, but Walter remained silent. "There we go," Green said, taking a step back to inspect their work. "Not so tough now, huh?" Both cops laughed when Harper took Walter's red cap, spun it on his finger, and then crookedly placed it on his own head. "How do I look? Pretty patriotic, right?" Walter's brows hardened. "This is your last warning. Let me go now, and I might consider being lenient when this is over." Harper withdrew. He pulled out his phone and took a picture. Walter's face is momentarily illuminated by the flash. "Oh, don't worry, Cheech. We'll let you go." He took a deep breath and forced himself to remain calm, because if there was one thing Walter Crane knew, it was how to endure. Eventually, they got back into their patrol car, the engine roaring to life. "See you later," Boss Green called out, waving as they vanished into the night. Walter was left alone, the ropes biting into his arms as he tested their strength, but they held firm. The cold wind cut through his clothes, and the forest seemed to press closer with each passing minute. He felt his legs hurt from standing still, and as the darkness seemed to enclose him, he concentrated on breathing. His thoughts were racing between frustration and determination, but even he had limits. This wasn't how his life or career was supposed to go. Suddenly, a faint sound, the crunch of boots on gravel, grew louder, and Walter's senses went into overdrive. Who could be out here at this hour? Was it Harper and Greenback for round 2? A beam of light cut through the darkness, and a voice called out gruff. But he was curious as to what the intonation was. The flashlight swayed until it finally fell on Walter, who was tied to the post the man holding as it approached. A wiry figure wearing a pair of well-worn work boots and a battered flannel jacket was visible. His face was wrinkled with age, but he moved quickly and deliberately. "Sir, are you?" he asked, his voice a mixture of surprise and worry. What on earth happened here? Walter squinted against the flashlight's glare. Let's just say it's a long story. Can you help me get out of this? The man didn't hesitate. He set the flashlight down and pulled out a pocket knife. Whoever did this to you ought to be ashamed of themselves, he muttered, sawing through the ropes. With precision, within moments, Walter was free. Blood poured back into his palms as he staggered forward and caught himself on the post. The man gave him a thorough examination, obviously attempting to piece together what had happened. Arms, thank you, Walter said, flexing his stiff fingers. You have no idea how much I needed that. You're sure you're all right? You look like you've been through the ringer, Walter replied, straightening up. But I need to get back to the station. There are a couple of officers who have some explaining to do. The man raised an eyebrow. Officers? You mean the cops did this to you? What exactly is going on? Complex. Walter's tone was stern, but the man shook his head and said, Believe me, they're not getting away with it. He was whispering something. Well, let me give you a lift. I have my truck nearby. It is not safe to stroll on this road after dark. Walter paused for a second before nodding. Thank you. The ride back to the station was silent, with the only sound piercing the darkness being the hum of the ancient truck engine. Walter had dealing with bullies before, but this was on a whole new level, and by the time they pulled into the precinct's parking lot, he knew exactly what he had. He glanced out the window, his mind racing with thoughts. To express gratitude once more, Walter stated, Getting out of the truck. You've accomplished more than enough. Look after yourself, Dude replied. Watching as Walter vanished into the station's shadows, I didn't want to attract any attention yet. He entered his office through the back door, avoiding the main floor, and sank into his chair. His fingers were already moving to wake up his laptop. He plugged in the dashcam's memory card and began scanning through the footage until he found what he was looking for. Harper and Green, smirking like children who believed they were untouchable. Their actions were all perfectly recorded, and the audio was crystal clear to their SN comments and threats. They didn't even bother to turn off the camera. Walter shook his head in shock and murmured. Amateurs, he reclined, his thoughts already racing with the potential proof that this wasn't merely a smoking gun but a cannonball. It was time for Walter to repay Harper and Green for making it personal. They're going to regret this, he whispered softly, a gloomy smile developing across his lips. Harper and Green, the two least concerned cops in the building, were sitting at the little table drinking coffee and grinning smugly at each other as the morning sun shone through the blinds of the precinct's break room. You should have seen the expression on his face when he said, Last night's antics was just another amusing tale to go under greatest hits. Harper laughed as he leaned back in his chair, all tied up like that priceless green. He smiled and stirred his coffee idly, and he continued to talk about being the new chief. They both laughed, not realizing the storm that was approaching them. The door suddenly flew open, and the relaxed atmosphere in the room vanished in an instant. Good morning, gentlemen. Walter Crane entered his presence like a chilly blast of wind slicing through the precinct. He was finely dressed, his face impassive but exuding authority. Walter, his voice was quiet, yet it had a steel-cutting edge. Harper's cup slipped out of his hand as he froze in mid-sip and breaking on the floor. His spoon was clinking against the side of his mug as he put it down with trembling fingers. Neither of them said anything. The expression in Walter's eyes said it all. Walter stepped forward with a folder under his arm. I hope you both had a good night's sleep. He continued his tone, which was laced with cold politeness, because you're going to need all the energy you can muster today. He cleared his throat in an attempt to regain some semblance of composure, Chief. He put the folder on the table with a raised palm, his eyes locking them both in place, save for the fact that I don't care about excuses. Table, and carefully opened it to see printed stills from the dash cam film. Each picture showed Harper and Green in all their glory, taunting Walter by tying him to the post and posturing as though they were only looking for a fun. Walter inquired, tapping one of the images with his finger. These are not merely images, they are proof of egregious wrongdoing, abuse of authority, and a total disregard for this department's principles. Green's mouth opened as though to object, but nothing came out. Harper appeared to want to vanish, and Walter leaned forward. Your acts are a shame to this badge, especially when his voice drops to a deadly level. This department and this community, and you obviously don't know me if you believe I'm just going to write you off and go away. I've also made sure the mayor is aware of what's been happening beneath his nose. He ended by taking a USB drive out of his pocket and holding it up. This contains all of the footage and audio from the whole night, and it has already been forwarded to Internal Affairs in the district attorney's office. Harper eventually found his voice, albeit wobbly at best. Chief, we didn't mean to offend anyone. Walter's voice ripped through Harper's words like a whip. But you didn't intend to infringe on someone's rights, didn't intend to damage this department's reputation, so please excuse me, he said, pointing to the door. You have 5 minutes to pack up your desks and turn in your badges. You're lucky that I won't have you carried out in handcuffs, but don't make a mistake because you will be held accountable for your conduct. Both officers were stunned and motionless as a result. As the door closed behind them, a faint ripple of applause came as Walter stepped back, his voice cold, and said, "Get out now." Slowly, Harper and Green Rose shuffled out of the break room, heads down, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. Walter watched them go, his expression unreadable. The other cops had gathered from the corridor, listening to everything that was said, and they weren't applauding Harper, and when Walter turned to face the group, his tone was measured but firm. Let this be a lesson to everyone here. This department will not tolerate corruption abuse or anything less than the highest standards of integrity. If you're not on board with that, there's the door. Green was applauding for Walter for the first time in years, because they saw a leader who wasn't afraid to hold people accountable no matter who they were. Every officer stood up a bit, and the room went quiet. Walter nodded contentedly and went back to his office for the first time, feeling a feeling of hope. This was about establishing the tone for a new chapter, not just about firing 2 poor cops. As far as if you were in Walter Crane's position, would you have handled the situation appropriately? He was worried about the future of his precinct, which had recently become much brighter. Leave a comment with your ideas. If you or someone you know has ever gone through something similar, please share your story below. If this story opened your eyes or inspired you, please remember to like it and share it with others who share your desire to change the world. We can raise awareness of these problems and endeavor to make the world a better place, the world. This story was written with the intention of bringing attention to pressing issues and encouraging constructive change. Your voice counts, and your viewpoint can have an influence.